Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome on our third and already last session of the Future of Health and Wellbeing webinar series of nexxworks. This series is moderated by Christophe Jauquet, our Healthusiasm author, and Christophe had very interesting conversations with Bill Duane from Google, Lavinia Ionita from Acacio, and this time we have Dr. Martyn Newman with us today. Before we start with the session with Martyn, I would like to quickly introduce myself and nexxworks. My name is France. I'm Innovation Program Manager at nexxworks, and I will be your host for this session. This means that I will be behind the screens helping Christophe out, and I will curate all your incoming questions. For the ones who do not know nexxworks, we are doing mainly two things. We like to inspire companies and we like to connect them to make sure that they are sharing bright and bold ideas to kickstart innovation. In non-COVID times, we fly all over the world, from China to the US to the Netherlands to Italy, wherever you would like to go, and depending on where the innovation brings us. We are making sure in these countries that you get an inspirational journey, but of course, during these COVID times, we're working mainly digital. This means that we're setting up a lot of international inspirational programs on a digital format. And the good thing is that there we're not linked to locations. So these programs are really getting very international. Even if you have one program, we have people from all over the world. If you would like to know more about nexxworks, just reach out to me via the chat or send an email to hello@nexxworks.com, and then we can talk further, of course. About practicalities, this is a 1-hour session, so it is a webinar, so you will be muted and your camera will be turned off, but please don't act muted. We have a Q&A button below on your screen, so definitely use it whenever you have a question for Christophe or Martyn. And when you have something that you would like to share with your peers, with the other participants, you can use the chat function. So all the links that you would like to share, just use a chat function. We will introduce a poll as well in the middle of the session and at the end to ask your feedback. And if you could share any other feedback, also the email addresses will work as well. We are using Zoom and we are using the internet, so if anything doesn't work out technically, you can just wait for a minute and then it will be solved automatically. Good to know is at the end of the session, we will gather the slides from Martyn and we will send them to you by next Tuesday, the latest. So if you didn't receive any recording or any slides before Tuesday or after Tuesday, then you should definitely check your spam folder because it might be in there as well. I'm ready to start the session of today. We have Dr. Martyn Newman with us, so I would like to introduce him to the session and say hello to Martyn.
Hello, nice to be a part of it, France. Thanks for the warm welcome.
You're welcome. How are you and where are you right now? I'm very curious about that.
Yeah, I'm really well. I'm actually down in the south of France. I couldn't be in a better place, just on Cap d'Antibes, so beautiful view over the Mediterranean with sailing boats drifting past. It's really good for my mental state. So I'm very fortunate. I just came from Australia, though, to be fair, which has probably got one of the more severe lockdowns and curfews and all those sorts of functions which play havoc with our mental state. So I'm in recovery mode and pleased to be here.
I'm a little bit jealous, but I'm also very zen today. So nice having you, Martyn. I would also like to say hi to Christophe, our moderator of this series. Christophe is the author of the book Healthusiasm, which is all about how people are more and more occupied about their health and how companies should act on that. So as a health marketer strategist, he's helping out startups and companies to make sure that they are implementing a healthcare strategy within their customer strategy, of course. So Christophe, a very warm welcome.
Hello, thank you.
I will leave you guys and I'll give you the floor and I'll come back in later in the session when it's almost finished. So see you later and enjoy.
See you later, friends. Thanks for the introduction. And yeah, welcome again everybody. As mentioned by Frans, this is the last of 3 webinars on the future of health and well-being at work. And we talk about this topic here at nexxworks, specifically because nexxworks wants to kickstart innovation. And for that, every company, like literally every company, needs to have their employees at the top of their game. And so in previous webinars, we talked to Bill Duane, who was a former well-being expert at Google. It was a super interesting conversation. We mostly ended up talking about the psychological safety and how that is important to companies and to ensure that people and teams performing well. Last week, we were talking about stress and stress management in a preventative way. And also there, we talked about how, trust and listening to your employees is super important. And this week, we go down that same road. And for that, we have indeed on the line, Dr. Martyn Newman. Also, welcome from my side, Dr.
Thanks, Christophe.
So maybe to briefly introduce you, so Dr. Martyn is a clinical psychologist, but I think he's most known, for being an authority in emotional intelligence, as well as in mindfulness, and certainly the way that you can practice it at work. He advises companies like, and I'm citing Citibank, Exxon, Deloitte, Mars, British Airways, and many, many others across the globe. And so, I really want to talk to you about his book, for a starter, because he wrote an interesting book. And I think if you are working in HR or if you are a team leader, I think this is really the book that you need to be having on yourself, and not only just having on yourself, but really deep diving into it. And the book is called Emotional Capitalists. And it displays, as you can see now on the screen, it displays a couple of gold bars. And let's just kick right into that, because I'd love to hear from you, Dr. Martyn. What is behind the title? And what is this emotional capitalist thing and the gold bars that are on there? Could you just enlighten us?
Yeah, thanks, Christophe. Yeah, well, it really came about. I was, I think, in Dubai talking to about 340 HR directors from around the region. And I asked them 2 questions. I was talking about Dan Goleman's book on emotional intelligence, that sort of burst onto the scene 20 years ago. And the first question I asked them was, look, how many of you have got that book on your shelf? And out of about 340 HR directors, 320 hands went up. You really can't be a self-respecting HR director today, it would appear, not at least have that book prominently displayed in your office somewhere. It's made that big of an impact. But the second question was really important. I asked them, and how many of you got past chapter 1? And how many hands do you think went up? It's amazing. 10. Yeah. 10. How the hell do you write one of the biggest selling books in the history of the social sciences, and hardly anyone gets past chapter 1, and there's several reasons for that, but it struck me straight away that part of the reason was when Dan wrote that 20 years ago, he after chapter 1, he got really stuck into a lot of dense theory. And, I was interested in what we'd learned about emotional intelligence 15 years later. So Emotional Capitalist is really an update on what we know about emotional intelligence. So it's not a theoretical book. It's really a handbook that provides something of a backstage pass, if you like, into understanding how emotions work to shape behavior. And then it gives a tactical blueprint on how you can actually cultivate greater professional and personal effectiveness by harnessing the power of emotional intelligence. But of course, businesses are not so interested in psychological theory, like I am as a psychologist. They're more interested in how to add commercial value to the business. In my view, though, there's a new currency driving performance today. People want to know that the business they work for is really making a difference. They want to know that it's adding some value to the world, how you treat people, customers, and so on. And I call this emotional capital because it operates like a currency in business, and you can measure its impact. You can think about the external emotional capital, which is the value really of the goodwill and the feelings that customers have, external stakeholders have towards business. The only way you can create real profit is to attract the emotional customer. And it's, like building an emotional contract with them that creates those repeat sales and so on. And the second bit component is the internal, what's the relationship you have with your employees? do you treat them as investors, you know, because every day they bring their heads and their hearts to work, and you know, if you're not treating them as investors, you won't be around very long. And then the third one is the way you show up yourself as a leader, how you manage your mood, how you engage people, how you make decisions, what you pay attention to. And all this, of course, has a very real impact, I think, on bottom line performance in a business.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's good that you mentioned the book, but because look what I have here. This is the book that that I got. I mean, when I was received the role of team leader, I actually got that book from my line manager, and I must say I struggled quite a bit, indeed, as you say, to get through it, because it's a very heavy book indeed, and so. It's very welcome that your book is much more of a practical guide, a handbook that you can use on an everyday basis. The other thing that I felt when I received that book actually is that it almost felt like an insult back then, like 20 years ago, because it was like as if I wasn't capable of, you know, managing my emotions or not really doing well. And I think over time, I think that's kind of like a good example of how people went about emotional intelligence as well. There's a lot of opinions about it. There's a lot of emotional attachment to it. There's even a lot of definitions about it. And I think I'd love to hear from you. How do you describe emotional intelligence, and how should people look at it? What is the theory behind it? How would you define it, basically?
Yeah, well, I think to pick up on your first point, you're absolutely right. When Dan published that book, you know, it was an era in which psychology generally, I think, was, you know, it was seen as a remedial intervention. If you went to see a psychologist, it was because, you know, you were trying to fix a problem. There was something deeply wrong with your mental health issues, perhaps, you know. But I think what we've seen in our lifetime more recently is a monumental shift away in business from a view of, you know, capitalism as an industrial age process defined by self-interest and profit maximization, towards what I'm calling now is an era of emotional capitalism, which is defined by generations of people who have a growing social and environmental consciousness, have deeply held feelings about universal human values. And I think this has created the climate now, 20 years later, where emotional intelligence is seen as part of that positive psychology movement, which is not just about ill health, but it's about how do we create the conditions for flourishing, human flourishing, for happiness, for well-being, and so on. So emotional intelligence really, as a definition, I think has a couple of components to it. You know, it's a long research history going right back into the 1920s. I think Edward Thorndike talked about social intelligence, and even Wechsler, who developed the intelligence tests, talked about the intrapersonal and interpersonal or non-intellective parts of intelligence. You know, out of those several models, the things I think they share in complements together at the simplest level is it's involved in two parts. First, becoming aware of our emotions in ourselves and in others and how that supports behavior. And then secondly, how do we develop the skills to manage those emotions intelligently, to solve problems that are emotionally and socially based. And I think that's the most practical understanding of emotional intelligence. And to illustrate it, you know, say a competency like self-awareness, you know, the ability to notice our emotions and what's driving our behavior, and to notice the impact of our behavior in other people. Many people lack that. So, you know, if you've ever been to a party and you've got stuck in a kitchen with someone who's talked at you for 30 minutes about achievements, you know, name dropping, you think, my God, my one night out all week, and I'm stuck with this self-referenced individual, you know, and they haven't noticed that you haven't actually spoken. And then suddenly it dawns on them, and in a moment of self-consciousness, they stop and they say, you know, well, that's enough about me. You know, what do you think about me? So, you know, there's a classic illustration of how when people lack self-awareness, their impact on other people is far less influential and far less valuable. Yeah,
I agree. And so you said that you had, you know, worked around how this emotional intelligence has evolved and the history a little bit. When we did this prep, you said you wanted to show something, a slide presentation on how you see things.
Sure.
Is there something you want to share with us and the study that you've done, or?
Yeah, well, there's the book, that you just held up. Now
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
unbelievable, but it's 20 years ago that book first came out. And
True.
really no one saw it coming, I think. And for those of you, those of folks on this call who perhaps haven't come across it yet or haven't got their hands on it, it was published in 1995. And at the time, it was a very radical title. Nobody had put the notion of emotions and intelligence together. In fact, the environment in which all of us were reared in had quite clinically separated the intellectual or the knowing part of our experience from the feeling part of our experience.
Sure.
Our schools have done that.
I think even just to pick in on that, I think when I first heard about it, I was paying a lot more attention to the intelligence part and less to the emotional part. You know what I mean? It was like, I will become more intelligent if I deal with my emotions or something. That was something that I rather expected. It was focused on the intelligent part.
That's right. And I think there's good reason for that, Christophe. I think, when we started talking about emotions, immediately a lot of people start to feel anxious, and they feel anxious because it's an area where, you've got to look within yourself. And if you're not particularly psychologically minded, a lot of people have been reared in environments where emotions are suspect, that they're not that welcome. And so and certainly our educational system, kids in schools, we've not paid attention to their feelings and to their experience. And I think that's why we've got so much disengagement and dropout rates across the board in schools. We've separated our feelings, the way we feel about the world, and from the way we think about the world. And this has been a massive mistake. And we've done that in business. We've tried to sort of split people up and bring their heads to work, but it's not been until quite recently that people's full selves, their emotional and richness of their cultural life, was really welcome in the workplace to be shared and talked about. So I think you're right, but most of us focused on the things we felt we could control, which was our intellect.
Totally true. So when you said education, it made me think of that maybe, the way that the way that millennials, for example, are educating their kids is perhaps a lot more emotional intelligence than the baby boomers did back then. I'm not quite sure. Do you also see that? It just came up to me when you said that the empathy part, the inclusion part, the explaining thing. I think right now the younger parents, they are a lot more focused on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's in this generation, we're far more conscious of the importance of really understanding how emotions really drive so much of our experience. We used to think it was, behavior was explained almost exclusively really by intellect or by personality factors driven by a combination of sticks or carrots. And you could kind of fix a person's behavior by either dialing up the sticks or dialing up the carrots, and in certain ways that's the model of education that's worked for 100 years, but it's been found to be really wanting. And people like Howard Gardner at Harvard University, who wrote the book Multiple Intelligence, recognized there was a whole bunch of kids who were falling through the gaps in the education system because of its narrowing of our understanding of emotions to focus exclusively on intellect. And I think what's driven our awareness and our greater interest and curiosity in emotional intelligence is the developments in neuroscience over the last few years, which has demonstrated conclusively that long before our intellect gets involved, we have a very primary physical and then emotional experience that arises to shape our perception and shape our decision-making apparatus and shape, therefore, our intellectual response, and that our judgments and behavior are really driven by these primary emotional experiences. And I think that's much more understood these days, and parents are, reaping the benefits of it, and kids too.
Yeah, but yet, even if perhaps from our view we see some improvement, if we look at education, it still remains quite difficult at work, right? This is where you come in, and where with your company, Dr Martyn, where you can help companies and to improving them. How do you go about this?
Well, that's right. And I think, there's both that sort of philosophical backdrop to the professional world. It's very slow, really, very conventional in many ways. And so psychological revolutions don't tend to take hold very quickly. They may rise up as fads, and a lot of people thought emotional intelligence would be, you know, like an American fad that would go the way of the yo-yo. But here we are 20 years later, it's more robust now, and I think more certainly the businesses I work with around the world, you know, traditional businesses like ExxonMobil, for example, where we've been for 5 years. These guys have spent 35 years on oil platforms and gas pipelines. You know, engineers, not typically the sort of people that you would imagine would be interested in a framework like emotional intelligence, or Boeing Aerospace, where we spent 6 years, or, you know, Sky, where we're in our 7th year now, a media company. And I think we've come to understand that these skills are not as soft as we once thought they were. And as soon as I think people recognize that there's a structure to them, that you can identify and deconstruct how they work to produce behavior, and then you can come up with technologies that begin to measure. And that's the key, I think, because, you know, as soon as you can begin to measure in an organization and correlate particular behaviors with performance and return on investment, and suddenly business gets very interested in that, I think. But I think that there was a generation, you know, that's younger, that read Dan's, a bit like you did, that read the first chapter of Dan's book and thought, oh my God, you know, this is like giving someone a glass of iced water who was in hell. You know, that it legitimated that the complexity of my intellect and how I deploy behavior was not simply limited by my academic score at school, my grade point average, but that I was capable of so much more and had so many other skills. And, you know, Howard Gardner drew our attention to multiple intelligences in the classroom. And one of those intelligences really was that he noticed that people who could manage relationships just did so much better, and people who could manage their own mental life and inoculate themselves against mental illness and so on just tend to flourish. And that's what the skills of emotional intelligence really are all about, I think.
And so, yeah, we're still looking, by the way, at your at the slides with the book by Daniel Coleman.
Okay, let me change it, because he didn't just do that, of course. He went on then to publish an article in the Harvard Business Review where he began to distill the relationship that emotional and social skills had, and how they underpinned the most effective leaders in enterprise around the world. And he wrote this article in the Harvard Business Review. And I spoke to the editor, Amy Bernstein, of the Harvard Business Review not that long ago. And she told me that article is the most requested article in the history of the review. So, you know, I think emotional intelligence's time has come.
And so from when was that article?
That was published in about 1998, I think. So it's going back a bit.
Okay. It's pretty impressive. But you yourself, I mean, if you work with companies, and also what you mentioned in your book is that you have developed or identified those 10 core competencies that help into becoming more emotional intelligent at work. Am I correct?
Yeah, well, I had lunch with Dan not that long ago, and, you know, I sat down with him and I said to him, listen, when you first came out with that book, there were a lot of us, you know, as academic psychologists in our ivory towers, that was very skeptical and very cynical, really, because he made some really big claims in that initial book. And there was not a lot of strong science to back them up. It was really quite thin on the ground. And so he agreed, to his credit. And he said, look, you know, it was 20 years ago and the science was only just starting. So I want you to imagine, Christophe, today, if, you know, prior to our session, I brought to you and you'd shared with everybody all of the published research from really good international peer-reviewed journals that had looked at the relationship over the last 15 years between emotional intelligence and leadership success, for example, some of the most influential people in the world. And we were able to sort of distill that in this session together and highlight our findings, and we all came back together and shared them. You know, that's a very interesting proposition. Now, if you did that, you know, if we all did that, let me show you, you'd have to read at least 117 really good, solid scholarly articles, and that doesn't include unpublished doctoral dissertations. If we put them into the mix, you've got 141. And to save you doing that, that's really what I've done and what our business has done. And we've read every single word and synthesized that data.
Impressive.
And what falls out of that data over and over and over again are these 10 skills that just show up, that sit behind some of the most successful people on the planet. If any of our listeners have got kids today, I can only say this to you as a person with a child psychology background, that once you've told your kids that you love them and they mustn't doubt the value of their lives for a second, these are the 10 skills to teach them, because these are the skills that set people up to really flourish and protect their mental health and well-being and tap into their talent and release it, make it dance, on the stage. So I think it's one of the most exciting things to come out of the behavioral sciences in the last few decades, to be honest.
It's strong. It's pretty strong. I'll certainly take that with me. Yeah. But please, if you have those 10 core competencies,
sure. I'll show them to you. So we built them into, I said the important thing in business, of course, and why I think business has been slow to pick this up, is they want good science, and we've got good science now. So we synthesized that data, and systematically over a decade, we built a robust psychometric called the Emotional Capital Report, and the ECR. And this is it didn't fall off the back of a women's weekly magazine or a men's health magazine. This is a robust piece of psychometric that's been tested around the world. We published research on over 8,000 senior leaders from 11 different geographical regions not that long ago. And it turns out that people who are exceptional at what they do, the mean is 100 and the standard deviation is 15. These exceptional leaders scored almost one standard deviation above the mean, indicating that emotional intelligence was contributing dramatically to their capacity to succeed and influence. But of course, the real interesting data come when you look beneath and you look at the 10 skills. So here are the 10 skills. Let me pull them in for you a bit. So begin to see them. So cast your eye over that, and we can then spend some time just pulling a few of them apart, the ones that are particularly interesting to you, if you like.
Yeah. So we have self-knowing, self-confidence, self-reliance, self-actualization, straightforwardness, relationship skills, empathy, adaptability, self-control, and optimism. What I would suggest, I don't know if that is okay for you, Dr. Martyn, but we have a poll ready where we can ask our audience whether they're interested in one or the other more than, is that okay if we just drop the poll right now?
Do it, because we haven't got time to talk about all 10. So let's pick the one.
I'm afraid so. Would be nice though, but let's just see how people react to that. But it might be good to really understand what is most important to our listeners here. And I think right now it's adaptability, as I see.
Maybe while people are making their choices, let me kick off with one just to give you a feel. Let's take one of the strong ones, say at the top there, like self-reliance or self-confidence, for example. But self-reliance, that's, again, almost a standard deviation above the mean in our leaders. And, I think Bruce Barton, the American philosopher, described it really well when he said, nothing splendid has ever been achieved except by those who dared to believe something inside them was superior to circumstance. I really like that. Or Friedrich Hegel, the German philosopher, said it differently. He said to be independent of public opinion is the first condition of achieving anything great. So in other words, if you're going to rise above your moment in history, if you're going to do something quite innovative and quite exceptional, then it comes from that deep reactor core of emotional courage that sits within you, and enables you to take independent decision, to find the courage to act into your moment and rise above the limitations of your circumstances. Actually has its roots in Stoic philosophy. It was Epicurus who said, you don't develop courage by being happy in your relationships every day. You develop it by surviving difficult times and challenging adversity. This is when heroic character is really forged. And so, you know, Marcus Aurelius was the same, another Stoic philosopher who believed that taking control of your mind, you know, when Aurelius lived through the Antonine plague, an ancient pandemic which wiped out a third of the population, and he had to carry on after his child died as well. So he recognized that those that thrive rather than simply survive are those that can resist the negative gravitational pull of the fear and panic around them, and can take responsibility for their actions and take personal control over their thoughts. And this is actually the wellspring of mental health. So I think self-reliance is a sort of a call to reclaim our personal power. And this enables you to author a powerful, influential leadership brand and to act into your moment.
It's pretty strong and pretty interesting, though, because I mean, I wouldn't say that self-reliance, I mean, it wouldn't come to my mind at least, that self-reliance is like one of the pillars of being emotional intelligence. You would rather think of it still perhaps in the older philosophy of emotional intelligence, but you would rather think of it as being more, as you said earlier, soft skills. And this is also what we see here in the results of the poll, I guess, because the topic or the competency that people want to hear about is straightforwardness, because straightforwardness actually goes in the same field. It's not particularly a soft skill. I mean, you need to be doing it probably a little bit soft, I can imagine, but it's a very strong thing to do, right?
It is, and for a long time, I questioned why would straightforwardness be an emotional skill, for example, part of an emotional repertoire, you know, of competencies. And it's not until you ask the question, what stops you being straightforward, then I think you start to get to the heart of it. You know, and you think about it, it's anxiety. And at two ends of the spectrum. So for those of us that, you know, maybe find it difficult to confront power and authority, or find it difficult to risk offending people and their judgment of us, they may not like us and so on. We may be a little bit tepid or timid in speaking the truth or challenging power. And so the anxiety that arises in our stomachs is really the first part of what we've got to manage. And that's part of a self-control, so that we're able to overcome that limitation. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got people who, you know, feel the anxiety because they feel like they're losing control. So the overbearing boss, the toxic leader, for example, is swallowed up with anxiety, and what they want to do is wrest back control, so they tend to dominate you. So you've got these sort of two perspectives. At the one end, passive people who tend not to act into the moment, and then you've got these overbearing dominant people, and the thing driving both of that behavior really is fundamentally anxiety. And so straightforwardness begins with that ability, emotional skill of learning to recognize your anxiety and rationalize it, and then being able to have the skills to manage it, and then to deliver your message calmly and thoughtfully. But another element of it is it's like a marketing message, really. What you want is not just to get into a fight or a polemic. You want to engage the other person with your point of view. And so empathy comes in as an emotional skill, because you have to try to recognize and validate the other person's perspective so they feel less combative and less hostile. So it becomes quite an emotional experience managing straightforwardness. And then there's all the tactical elements of it. And, you know, what we've done is distill all of these tactics into building blocks and formulas so that people have got a sort of roadmap that they can follow that keeps them psychologically safe, so that they can deliver that message. And that's why one of the great things about emotional intelligence, unlike personality, is that you can cultivate and develop the skills that can really change the way you impact on other people.
I'd like to pick in on that, but maybe just maybe we should stop sharing your screen so that people can actually see you a little bit more up close. I think that's more fun to do. But I mean, we had a question from the audience, from Rich Davino, and just picking in on what you said earlier, is that you can actually build upon it. That is something that you can learn and actually achieve within companies. The question that we received was, how does it go typically? Is it rather top down or is it bottom up? And I mean, I can imagine that perhaps it is more top down, but when as an employee do you actually try to be that straightforward so that you can actually try to change culture or make eyes go open, for example?
Okay, yeah. No, that's a great question, and that goes to the heart of strategy, doesn't it? And
yeah, true.
It really depends on who's driving. You know, if you're looking to change culture, essentially that's really got to come from the top, because if the senior management team in some way have not bought into that or are not backing it, you're going to be always fighting an uphill battle. So if you take Sky, for example, where we've been for the last 7 years, you know, I sat down with Jeremy Darrett, the CEO, the group CEO of Sky, and he started with the executive around the table, walked into the boardroom, and they all came in with their arms folded, you know, a little bit like, you know, we haven't got time for this soft stuff, you know, this is HR territory. But once they could see the science, once they could see the commercial imperative, they became curious about it. And of course, then once you pull the curtain back and a person's able to look into the mirror of their own profile and identify the things that have underpinned their success, and also get some reflection and feedback on the things that they may not have paid so much attention to, once they understand that there's a pathway that they can actually become more influential and achieve the outcomes much more effectively by using their emotional intelligence instead of just their well-worn personality patterns or habits they've fallen into, suddenly they become really interested. Now, once senior management starts to transform the culture and the way it leads, then it gives permission for everybody across the organization to begin to behave differently. I remember one senior guy at Sky who had what they say at Sky is that that's a euphemism. There's some really big personalities here, you know, which is a euphemism for some difficult characters. And once this guy came out, he actually put up a board next to his desk with the commitments he'd made to certain behavioral changes in the way he led. And he asked his entire team to hold him accountable to those behaviors. And so fundamentally, you know, it's a values-led process. It's not just about tactics and strategies. Each of these competencies actually sit on top of a value. And once senior people buy into the value, then it becomes, you know, gives great psychological safety and permission for everybody to start living out those values.
Yeah. And I think it's something that I lived as well from my experience. I've always had the tendency to something which I call upward coaching. Mm-hmm. So try to give feedback. It's not really coaching, but it's more like giving feedback to my line manager in that case on what I found personally good or bad in the way that he approached stuff. But would you recommend like this kind of approach to people within the organization to actually also be a little bit proactive and straightforward into being open and empathic, and perhaps display certain kind of level of self-confidence or empathy towards leaders then?
Yeah, look, I think your first comment's right about the feedback process. The thing that really, I think, creates a real engine of change inside an organizational culture is when, you know, you use something like the ECR 360, where quite quickly, rather than thinking about it, and I say this to senior leaders, this is not about whether you're good, bad, or ugly. No. Think about the feedback from a 360 process as what do other people need from you that they say they're not getting. So if somebody scores you low on empathy, but you've performed really well on self-confidence and self-reliance and straightforwardness. But you know, there's low scores on empathy and relationship skills. It might be that people are saying, look, you move past us too quickly. You're not listening. We don't feel that you understand our experience. And so we tend to back off. You know, I had one guy, for example, who told me he'd been shooting himself in the foot for 20 years after he did his ECR 360, a very senior guy at a large organization. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, in our business, we need people to innovate really quickly in an agile way and bring new ideas to the table all the time. And I've realized that people don't speak up, and they don't speak up because they're afraid of me. And I said, what is it? Don't you like people? He said no. So I said, well, you know, why do you abuse them? He said, I have no idea. So once we did his ECR, and he could begin to see and pay attention and become more self-aware that when somebody presented a new idea, he would start to feel his jaw tensing, a tightness across his chest and a disturbance in his stomach. And so that self-awareness process then enabled him to interrupt the flow on of habit, where he sought to then control the situation by bullying people. And by introducing that gap, he could create a psychologically safe place, but it began with self-awareness. And then he could deploy empathy and relationship skills to create the right climate for people to contribute. And he found over time that radically changed the team's contribution in terms of, innovation and bringing new products to market. So these are very tactical, very practical skills, but they demand a degree of psychological insight.
Yeah, and that's super interesting because certainly in this case, I mean, nexxworks, they stand for kickstarting innovation. So what they try to obtain always when working with companies is making sure that all employees and the company as a whole actually can come up with the right innovations to survive. And this is a good example of one of the skills out there, one of your core competencies for emotional intelligence that actually help that. Are there any other ones that you can think of, perhaps examples that you have of your core competencies that actually help in being more innovative or assuring an innovative climate or culture within a company?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's think about innovation. When we think about innovation, we usually think about individuals and what are the emotional and particular creative skills that individuals bring to the table. And that's not a bad idea. And we can certainly look at a profile like this and say, look, adaptability, people who are less rigidly fixated on certain ideas, that are open and receptive to new ideas, are typically going to be more innovative and so on. Or self-actualization, where there's passion and that drives innovation. People really love what they do and so on. But those are not really the fundamental things that drive innovation. And all of the research comes really out of MIT, and it's not a place where you would imagine emotional intelligence skills. Now, I'm not quite sure how I can get to this slide, but it's really interesting. So let me just click through a bit and see if I can get to the slide I prepared earlier. Some interesting ones here that we can talk about. But this is the one, sorry about this, I just don't know how to do it more quickly. This guy, Alex Pentland. So he's been puzzled by the question of, what creates the most innovative teams. And so he identified a number of factors, like, he put in place rewards, and he put in place the environmental conditions in which they're doing their work. He looked at the IQ of the team and so on, and tested a lot of different models in hundreds of teams around the world. And then he struck the one element that seemed to really drive innovation. So what he did was he gave all of these teams pictures, 36 black and white photographs of just the eye region of a person's face. And then they had to pick what was the emotion that person was experiencing at the time. So give that one a go, Christophe. What do you think this person's experiencing?
I would say panicked.
Exactly, that's right. So you're good at this. And then what about this one? That's a tough one.
I would say playful.
Yeah, it could be that, but it's really irritated. She's kind of got an edge to it where the eyes have narrowed a bit. Look at this one. Ooh, if you don't get this one right, you're in all sorts of trouble. That's desire.
Desire.
Yeah, that's right.
But that's the one I recognize. It happens a lot.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So obviously, this is more than simply about reading
emotions.
Reading eyes, really. It's about, what we found was that people who scored really well on that, who could read people's emotions, it was correlated with the most innovative teams. And of course, it's empathy. So it was leaders who could create, who could recognize the meaning of a furrowed brow or the silent wish to join a conversation and create the psychologically safe place where people then would share ideas. And so it increased the amount of idea flow across the group. And then equally correlated was that with the amount of turn taking within the group, respect for one another. So creating this ferment amongst the group of deep emotional sharing that produced and drove the most creative teams on the planet. Now, I found that really fascinating because we replicated this at Sky, and we took in a blind study 500 of the 8,000, and HR gave me the data and said, look, just work out here who are the most effective creative teams. And I'll show you the data if I've got it here. Turns out with Sky that if you can just see that, if you look at the profile on the left, the leadership group, the team leaders that were leading teams that were producing more products that were taken to market more successfully were significantly stronger on emotional intelligence skills like self-actualization, you know, passionate people bringing a deep sense of meaning and value to their work, relationship skills. They were all about encouraging diversity and difference in the group and celebrating that, so more ideas were shared. Empathy, making everyone feel valued and a part of the group. And then as well as those capacities for not being rigid and closed-minded, but open. And this group of leaders at Sky were the group that were bringing to market the successful products in an environment that's extremely demanding and, you know, and very fast-paced. So we know that innovation really sits atop a lot of emotional skills, but then more than just these individual skills, it broadens out to a cultural environment that you create through building emotional intelligence.
Okay, so now the $1 million question. I mean, everybody on the line wants to have innovative, well-performing teams. How do you get to those numbers? How do you change teams and how do you change the culture so that you get those results?
Well, again, I think, you know, it's really about creating a climate, and it's about climate control. It's about understanding that people are at work today and not just to make money. You know, they're there because they care about what they do. And the more an organization can identify values and create the conditions where people can operationalize those values. So for example, if you look at empathy, the one we talked about, you know, you talk to the Dalai Lama and he talks about compassion all the time. Well, psychology is not so interested in compassion. You know, it's more of an ethical, it's a softer sort of skill. But if you want to operationalize how you express compassion and care for other people, psychology would talk about empathy and look at the structure of empathy. So immediately, you know, that becomes a value, and it's not just stuck on the fridge in the canteen or on the frosted glass, you know, on the executive boardroom, but it's actually the way the organization operates, that we respond compassionately and carefully to people. Or if you look at, say, adaptability, again, you know, the Dalai Lama might talk about tolerance. Well, in psychology, again, we're more interested in operationalizing that value. So if I'm not tolerant of difference, then I'll be rigid and closed-minded. So tolerance as a value underpins the emotional competency of adaptability, in which I respond reflexively and agilely and adjust my perspective in order to take into account the shifting environment. So I think, you know, what you've really got to focus on is understanding that these are not just tactics and strategies. They are fundamentally values that are operationalized through the emotional intelligence framework. And that's what gives them depth. That's why we're still talking about it, I think, 20 years later. And it didn't go the way of, you know, the American yo-yo, because they really tap into some very core, fundamental parts of us as human beings that we tend to operate at our best when we're in an environment where we're living out our values and behaving according to our values, and those values become shared with our colleagues.
Yeah. And I think it's remarkable. You mentioned also that, you know, adaptability is one of the key pillars. And I have to say that within the poll that we ran, adaptability was the second most preferred to elaborate about. And I think that's no real coincidence, considered that we're living in a time where we all really need to be adaptable as planning has become a little bit more difficult with the whole virus thing going on. And that means for us as a human being, it's certainly a core competency that we need, but also as a company. Any final thoughts when we're heading towards the end regarding adaptability and how that would be, how, I don't know, any tips and tricks or perhaps good examples of company that actually have done it in the past where you say like, look, if I can tell you one thing, this would be the one thing that you could perhaps try to install in your company?
So adaptability is, and again, you've got to look at the components of it, I think, to really understand it. So in a nutshell, there are three elements to adaptability. The first thing is acceptance. If you're someone who's in a constant state of combat and fighting for a position relentlessly, that tends to narrow your perspective a lot. Those people who remain accepting, and certainly of themselves, we tend to pass judgment very quickly, and it's very difficult to change behavior once you have a default position of passing judgment on it. I think that's why mindfulness has become such a potent sort of mind training technology, really, because it's look at observe your behavior without judgment and just see what you think is motivating that, what's behind it, rather than this constant knee-jerk. So acceptance is the first condition. We've just got to move non-judgmentally. Tell me more about how you see the world, and then there's an open-mindedness. I think a receptivity to new things. Einstein said the first decision we've got to make when we're young is the universe friendly? I really like that, like if you grow up in an environment where you feel the world's against you constantly and you start to develop that mindset, and understandably for a lot of people, but it's very difficult to adapt because you become very fundamentalist, very narrow in your perspective. But if you see the world as, working for you, as full of opportunity, then you can take into new perspectives and you can begin to become receptive to diversity and other people's points of view. And then the third thing, of course, is flexibility. And one of the great wellsprings of mental health and well-being, the thing that really inoculates you in many ways against mental health issues and psychopathology, is psychological flexibility. This ability not to hold too tightly to the world must be this way, or I must be this way, or you must be this way. And as I loosen my grip on that, I become more pliable and able to shift perspective. And so we can let go of those sort of well-worn habits of personality. And what I love about emotional intelligence, is its capacity to be developed. So personality, you go to a school reunion in your 20s and people say, oh, I'd recognize you anywhere. You haven't changed a bit. And that's because by the time you're in your 20s, your personality doesn't change very much. But emotional intelligence is a set of competencies and skills, which when you can interrupt the habitual pattern and observe your behavior, you can then choose actions based on your values rather than these well-worn patterns of personality. And that opens up an entirely new repertoire of responses you can make. And of course, once leaders grasp that, they realize, my God, I can actually change the performance of my business as I enable people to open up to skills they need to seize new opportunities, see what's over the horizon, and deep resilience in the pit of the stomach to go back in the face of setback, and so on. So adaptability becomes an extraordinarily useful skill. And I think for Sky, they built this over 6 years, and they had a very rigid culture. They couldn't attract talent. They couldn't, there was a lot of turnover because the culture was pretty ruthless. Mm-hmm. And then, they had 20 quarters of straight growth. And last year, in a bidding war with Fox, Comcast bought them for $40 billion. And I had breakfast with the COO, Chris Stiliano, not that long ago. And Chris told me, look, the reason we were so successful is because we got our culture right. And we became agile. We created psychological safety. We looked after our people. People wanted to work at Sky, and so on.
That's wonderful. And I think what you mentioned about adaptability, the fact that you need acceptance, receptivity, and flexibility, I think those are also three things that are super important when companies want to innovate. And with this, I think I'd like to thank you, Dr. Martyn, because it was super interesting to talk to you. And this was actually the last of our 3 webinars. We talked about psychological safety. We talked about a data-driven approach to stress management. But now today, I think what struck me most and the sentence that resonated most with me was, we have skills that we can learn based on the actions and the values that we want to have. And I think that is something really powerful. I mean, if we really have those values, we can change our actions and we can build those skills. So thank you very much for your kind words and this very interesting talk. I'll give the word back to Frans now.
Thanks, Christophe.
Thanks a lot, Christophe. Thanks a lot, Martin. And of course, thanks a lot to all the participants of this series. I've just launched a poll to get your feedback because we're still learning a lot. And of course, if you have any topic that you would like to recommend, definitely let us know. I'm very happy that I could be the host of this series. And I would like to recommend our next series as well, which is about the future of mobility. It's in October 16th. And in the meanwhile, we will have our blog and our podcasts to inspire you further in the upcoming months. So a very warm thank you and a goodbye from the whole nexxworks team. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Frans. Cheers.
Bye, Dr. Martyn. Bye, everybody.